several reasons. This is my several reasons the UFC currently sucks. This is another rant. This is another rant on the UFC. The UFC, the current UFC, has ruined MMA and martial arts in general. John McCain and Dana White have killed MMA and have ruined UFC, man. Have ruined UFC. Of course, let's go back to my favorite era. Of course, in my opinion, the UFC was good from 1993 up until about late 2008 and early 2009, right around the time Brock Lesnar debut. Brock Lesnar debut. Um, but before I get to Brock Lesnar, let's start off with the no rules era. When the UFC was no rules, it was awesome. I love the tournament format. The whole thing was like a real life version of Street Fighter and Bloodsport and what's that movie called again? Mad Max Thunderdome. 2 man in or 1 man leaves. It was awesome, man. And one thing I loved about the early UFC events was that, well, the fighters, they couldn't wear like combat boots or wrestling boots, professional wrestling boots in the cage. One thing I liked was that the fighters got to dress however they please, which made it more gimmicky and cool. The fighters got to wear whatever they wanted, and it was no weight class. It was best of the best. It was tough. And they were really trying to see what fighting styles were the best, and you got to see lots of cool fighting styles, lots of cool fighters, and lots of highly exciting fights. In this era, they finished fights in this era, not this lay and pray stuff, which I'm about to get to in a minute. And it was awesome. Then, of course, John McCain tried to ban the UFC and accuse it of human cockpit fighting. Here's the first problem I have with that. First of all, the difference between a cockfight, or any form of animal fighting is that the animals are being forced to fight and don't want to fight. The humans, we sign off on it. They sign off on it. They agree to it. Just like in boxing, just like in football, just like in hockey, just like in professional wrestling. They sign off on all that crazy stuff they're doing. And you're trying to say, oh, MMA is bad, but war is good. War is good if people can choose to go overseas to fight for our freedom. They should be able to fight for a living. Living in this circuit right here. But of course, this part I actually agree with. They put gloves on the fighters. Yes, I want you to put as much safety equipment on the guys as possible because I want these guys to go all out. Okay, even though it takes away the concept, I also understood why they had to add weight classes, and I didn't like them taking away the tournament format and using boxing's format. Dana was supposedly a amateur boxer and worked in boxing, so he decided to bring boxing to MMA. I didn't like how they used the boxing format. Now it's just a bunch of overhyped, overpriced super fights. I didn't like that, but it was still good. Because you actually got better fighters in this era. And this era, the first UFC era from 93 till 98 or 97, this was what I like to call the no rules era. This era was similar to ECW. What ECW was. ECW was breaking all the rules of professional wrestling and was changing the game. changing the game and breaking a lot of stereotypical taboos associated with professional wrestling. Then you got this new era of MMA with larger than life personalities like Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, and the largest personality, the second real heel. The first heel was Tank Abbott. But the second real heel was Tito Ortiz. The first real heel was Tito Ortiz because Tank Abbott started losing when they transferred over to this era of the UFC. This era was like the UFC from 98 till 2008. This era was like UFC's Attitude Era. This was UFC's Attitude Era. You had awesome fighters like Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture. Tito Ortiz, in my opinion, wasn't the best fighter, but he was highly exciting to watch. And the charisma and look. And of course Vitor Belfort, Matt Serra, Baz Rutten, kickboxer Maurice Smith, Pedro Hizo, Rigo Rodriguez, Andre Orlovsky, Phil Baroni, Eugene Jackson, Frank Shamrock, Matt Serra, Weaves Edwards, Ruthless Robbie Lawler, who's still there today, Dwayne Ludwig, who's also still here today, Mr. International, Shoney Carter, Pete Spratt, like I said, so many awesome fighters, and then you got so like I said, it was awesome. It was awesome, and this whole thing was awesome up until about 2008 when Brock Lesnar started fighting. Brock Lesnar, Quentin Rampage Jackson, and the Gracies, these guys are the innovators and are responsible for some of the most mediocre and boring fighters. Fighters who aren't even martial artists, who aren't even really all that good. They're just wrestlers and brawlers and not good ones like Tank Abbott, Paul Valorez, and Bob Sapp or James Thompson. Not good exciting brawlers. These guys are what I like to call it. These guys are responsible for laying and praying. Immediately wrestling the guy and laying on top of him for several periods, and there's a decision. Because they can't stand and fight. They gotta wrestle and roll around all day. That's what Rampage, Brock Lesnar, and the Gracies were known for. These guys couldn't stand up and fight, so he had to invent ground fighting. But Brock Lesnar, when he came, it was all hype. There were no exciting fights during the period when he was there. I can't remember one exciting fight. Brock Lesnar, I supported Brock Lesnar becoming a UFC fighter because I understood what he wanted. He wanted to prove that him, a professional wrestler, could fight for real. And of course, he stuck it to Vince McMahon, which I like. He stuck it to Vince McMahon, and even though he gave the UFC lots of money and exposure, like I said, that whole thing, him fighting, was crap. It was garbage. And like it was garbage. And of course, oh yes, putting the UFC fighters in there, putting the annoying UFC fans in their face, the ones who are always bashing professional wrestling and bashing professional wrestling fans and acting like they're badasses. Yeah, how credible is your organization when a professional wrestler comes there and wins your top title? Yeah. Like I said, this whole thing, like I said, but Brock Lesnar fighting was just terrible. And he's responsible for all these boring NCAA wrestlers who are wrestlers outside of high school and college, trying to be professional fighters. These mediocre fighters. Brock Lesnar, Rampage, and Gracie's. They're responsible for this. But I'm gonna talk more about those guys in an overrated MMA fighters list. But going back to Brock Lesnar, there were no good fights. The fights were slow paced, boring wrestling fights. They were all hype. They were all hype. Fighters getting injured left to right. Fighters getting injured left to right, and fights that appear to be. I'm not going to accuse any fights of being fixed. Fights that appear to be fixed. Fights like I remember one of the most disappointing fights I watched was Mauricio Shogun Rua and John Bone Jones. John Bone Jones. This right here was one of the most disappointing fights I've ever watched, man. This was the most disappointing fights I've ever watched. It was like Mauricio Shogun Rua was told to take a dive during the fight. Cause the whole fight he wasn't even trying to fight, man. It was just disappointing, man. And then so like I said, just a boring product. Then of course you got Dana White rewriting history, not showing a lot of the old UFC. See with Ken Shamrock, Bass Rudin, Randy Couture, and Tito Ortiz, banishing them from the history books. And Randy Couture, Dana started speaking negatively about him just because Randy Couture wanted to do some stuff with Bellator, and he banned him. He banned him from the UFC events. He can't go to the UFC events. He can't go to the UFC events, and so yeah, this is why the UFC sucks, and all the pay-per-views are either okay to mediocre to or just not good or just boring and not good. And sometimes you may have a good main event, but I don't even make it to the main event because of how boring the undercard is. So yeah, then of course, oh yes, signing Quentin Rampage Jackson. Quentin Rampage Jackson, in my opinion, is one of the most overrated fighters of all time. Can't call him the worst because he's won his fight. He's proved himself. I respect what he's done for MMA, but he sucks and is, in my opinion, just a mediocre fighter. This guy, he first off, he talks about how much UFC ruined MMA and how he's gonna fight for the fans. He goes to Bellator, then 1 minute he's saying some crap like Bellator to honor his contract, and now he's back, and then he instead decides to return to the UFC, the same place he bashed and talked about how he's good to be back and how he's trying to make UFC better and stuff. And I just hate him because he talks about fighting for the fans, and he also brags and talks about kicking butt. But whenever he stands and fights someone who can actually kickbox, or a good stand-up fighter, he lays in praise. That's what he did with Machida, and that's what he did with Murillo Ninja Rua, the brother of Mauricio Shogun Rua in Pride. And oh yes, the Machida fight. I wanted Machida to beat his butt so he would get cut from the UFC. Laid and prayed the old fight, and he had a nerve, and he had the nerve to say he was gonna give the fans an awesome fight before the event. Before the event. And so now he's back. He's back in the UFC. He doesn't train for fights. Bashed TNA. He bashed TNA. So yeah, just hate Rampage. Hate the fact he's back in UFC. This right here, I'm actually mixed about this. Half of me is happy about this. Half of me is pissed off of this. Signing CM Punk. Let me talk about the positives first. What I like about this is that CM Punk was boring in his last several years in WWE, so now he gets to start a new life in the UFC, and I love CM, and I respect CM Punk for finally putting his foot down and leaving after things didn't go the way he wanted. He wanted that main event spot at WrestleMania, and he didn't get it, and they wouldn't let him be the top babyface, and I respect him for putting his foot down and leaving that godforsaken company, WWE. And now he gets to start a new life here. He's writing a comic for Marvel. He's gonna be in the Ninja Turtles movie, and he's gonna fight in the UFC. I can't wait. Hopefully he makes the UFC exciting again. Because him and Conor McGregor and Dennis Seaver are like the only fighters I care for. There are other fighters I like, but I want them to leave and go to Bellator. Speaking of leaving, oh yeah, but that's the positive. positive. Let me get to the negative. What I don't like about CM Punk. First off, Dana White wants nothing to do with professional wrestling. He wants to be as real as it gets. He wants no gimmickiness, no showmanship, nothing. He wants this to be real as it gets. He wants this to be like a sport instead of a spectacle, which is what it's supposed to be. He wants it to be like a sport, like football and basketball and hockey and stuff. He wants this to be a sport. He wants this to be a sport instead of a spectacle, and I don't like that. And so he wants nothing to do with professional wrestling. Yet he does gimmicky stuff. He has overhyped. He has characters. He has dramatic professional wrestling style build up to fights, particularly the John Jones Daniel Cormier fight, where sometimes it's mostly the build up. The fights aren't even good. Case in point would be the Daniel Cormier and John Jones fight, or a better example would be the Rashad Evans Rampage fight from 2010, which was terrible, but the build up was good. So it's all hype, but the fights be disappointing. The fights be disappointing. So that, and then of course he wants nothing to do with professional wrestling, yet he signed CM Punk. And then at least with Kimbo Slice was an undefeated street brawler. Brock Lesnar at least was an undefeated NCAA champion. Who did CM Punk beat to earn in the UFC? This guy never fought anyone for real. Who did he beat? See right there. And then he bashed it. Does stuff like signing CM Punk, and he did this because, like I said, the UFC buy rates and stuff are down and stuff. So he just like McMahon, just like Vince McMahon, he has to pull dumb stuff like signing CM Punk, and how disrespectful is that to the fighters on the smaller MMA circuits who are busting their butts to get to the UFC, and then of course so you're just overhyped fights, annoying fighters. These guys aren't like real tough guys. Maybe they're real tough guys, but they're guys who like think they're tough, think they're badass and stuff. They're not real martial artists or like real fight. They're not like real martial artists. They're just annoying tough guys. Ronda Rousey is one of the most annoying female fighters of all time. I hope Cyborg or Christina Carrano, I hope one of those fighters that come there one day and just shut her up. I'm sick of her trash talking. She thinks she's like cool. She thinks she's all cool and tough and badass because she's a judo champion. She thinks she can take Mayweather. When one punch from Mayweather, in my opinion, she'd be knocked out. Sick of her. And then of course you got John Jones, I don't remember what he did. I get confused. Either he ran over a pregnant woman or he broke a pregnant woman's arm and just drove off. Either way, his acts was disgusting, and I don't care what happens to him after that. And his fights in his later fights were absolutely terrible. And that whole feud with Daniel Cormier, that was butts too, and a disgrace to martial arts. I can't believe that won feud of the year. But that goes to show you that UFC is all hype right there. Oh yes, mistreatment of the fighters. Vanderlei Silva retiring. When Vanderlei Silva got busted for performance enhancing drugs, I took it as Vanderlei Silva being an absolute druggie. But when I listened to his passionate interview, which you can find when he left the UFC, when he was talking about how Dana White disrespected fighter Barrio, I think that was his name, how Dana White disrespected fighter Barrio by forcing him to train after fights, forcing him to fight continuously and train continuously. Then after he loses a fight, he doesn't get his money. He doesn't get his not only does he not get his money, but he gets disrespected by the media. Which shows Dana White. And of course, I've heard several stories about how the UFC fighters, they're not getting the money that they're supposed to be paid. Only top fighters get to make that money, but yet there's more money going in. Ken Shamrock said it. When he said it, I took it as Ken Shamrock being a bitter employee. And he is a bitter employee. He probably wouldn't be saying this if he was still employed with the UFC. But then when more fighters began to complain, I started to see in Vanderlei Silva, and they spring the random drug testing on him. To try to look good, to try to play it safe and look good. Why does the drug test have to be random? Why does the drug test have to be random? Why can't you just announce beforehand that you're gonna start testing people? Then of course people like Vanderlei Silva, they have to take these performance enhancing drugs to maintain that performance. And speaking of maintaining that performance, Mark Coleman, who has all these injuries and needs all these surgeries and has to rely on his Olympic team to pay all these surgeries he has from fighting. Dana White just cut him. Why couldn't he get another job in the UFC like Chuck Liddell did? Why couldn't he get a Legends contract like Chuck Liddell did? So yeah, mistreatment of the fighters. Mistreatment of fighters, and then monopolizing the entire MMA game. So not only the fighters, they just like WWE, they can't have jobs and stuff outside of the UFC unless you're CM Punk. They can't fight anywhere else. They have to fight exclusively for the UFC, like some crappy wrestling organization. It's supposed to be a fight organization, which means if a fighter wants to be widely considered the best, he has to come to the UFC. You can't have the fighters proving that they're real champions by fighting all over the world. They're crappy company champions. He doesn't want to do this because he doesn't want his fighters to lose, like what happened when Chuck Liddell went to the Pride Fighting Championships and lost to Rampage in the Grand Prix. Then another reason I hate Dana UFC is that most of the fighters, like I said, are just boring jiu-jitsu and wrestler brawler type guys, and Dana has the nerve to call that martial arts and call these guys the greatest fighters in the world when they have some of the worst punches and kicks I've ever seen, and they're just wrestlers. They just wrestlers. They can't stand, so they immediately take it to the ground. They immediately take it to the ground. Overpriced pay-per-views. I remember I saw one UFC event was like $60 overpriced pay-per-views and too many shows, just like WWE. Too many shows, overexposure of the product, and just too many mediocre fighters these days, man. Too many mediocre fighters these days. Well, like I said, screw the UFC. This was my rant. This was my second rant on UFC. I may do a Dana White rant video in the future, but this right here was my second rant on the UFC. All right. Dug out.